Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, I'm talking about the best albums of the 2000s by year. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So whenever the greatest decades of music are brought up, typically it's the 70s, 80s, or 90s. I think the 2000s kind of gets a little overlooked, though. I'm not saying I would put it over any of those decades, but there were so many great albums that came out over the decade of the 2000s. Yeah, I think there were a couple of years a little weaker than some other ones, but so many of those years were just jam-packed full of incredible albums. I think just when you look at overall quality of the decade, it just gets overlooked a lot. So I'm going to go through the 2000s, starting in 2000, ending in 2009, and pick what I think is the best album for each one of those years. But like anything regarding music, it's always very subjective. You could take 100 people, put them all in a room, and they'll come up with 100 different lists. So make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think are the best albums of the 2000s by year. So I'm going to start with 2000. Some incredible albums came out that year. I'm sure I'm going to miss a ton of them, but some of the ones I considered, The Cure released Blood Flowers that year, Pearl Jam's Binaural, Green Day released Warning, The Ever-Passing Moment by MXPX, which I think is a criminally underrated album. Coldplay's first album, Parachutes, came out that year. The Marshall Mathers LP, which I think is probably one of the top 5 rap albums of all time, released that year also. And while all those albums are great, I decided to go with what I've long considered probably the best debut album of the 21st century, and that's Hybrid Theory by Linkin Park. I remember when this album came out. It took me a while to listen to it. Like I said, this came out in 2000. It was probably like the very end of the year. I was out with some of the guys I worked with at the time, and they just kept talking about this album. And I had heard a couple of singles off of it. I was never a big nu metal fan, but I think it's kind of the thing that caused me to kind of hold off on listening to it. But once I did, I was hooked. I think this and their second album, Meteora, easily 2 of the best albums of the decade. I think as Linkin Park went on through their career, they did, like I said, Meteor was a great album, Minutes to Midnight was okay. They just never were able to really recapture the greatness that they had on this album, even though Meteor came pretty close to it. 2001, another banner year, just absolutely jam-packed with incredible albums. Some of the ones I did consider for that year, Rocksteady by No Doubt, which I think is underrated when it comes to No Doubt albums. Songs in A Minor by Alicia Keys, Toxicity by System of a Down. Weezer released a Green album that year. The Donnas Turned 21, an incredible punk album. I think it's probably the second best album from the Donnas. Sing Loud, Sing Proud by Dropkick Murphys. From Here to Infirmary by Alkaline Trio. But the album I picked for 2001, I might get a little pushback for, but it was a huge success. It sold over 2 million copies in the U.S. It would hit number 1 on the Billboard 200. It would absolutely dominate that year. I don't think this album came out of my CD player at all that year. But let's Take Off Your Pants and Jacket by Blink-182. Of course, Blink-182 would become one of the biggest bands in the world when they would release Enema of the State in 1999. But with Take Off Your Pants and Jacket, it was definitely it was like a darker turn for the band. They kind of moved away from some of the humor they had on Enema of the State. As much as I love Enema of the State, I think Take Off Your Pants and Jacket is just more of a complete album. This is the band trying to really figure out where they wanted to go musically and growing and maturing as a band doing it. And as much as people want to badmouth not only Blink-182, but that whole punk revival in the early 2000s, I think this album is probably the best that came out of that period. So 2002, I think, was a really difficult year for me to pick. It seemed like every time I went down through the list, I would pick out and remember albums I missed and have to rearrange my albums. And I think I went through probably at least 3 or 4 different albums before I decided to land on the one I landed on. But some of the great albums I did consider for that year, The Young and the Hopeless by Good Charlotte, which I think was probably my pick for that year for a while. But The Eminem Show came out that year, which is a massive album. Songs for the Deaf by Queens of the Stone Age, Rush of Blood to the Head by Coldplay, Against Me, Reinventing Axl Rose, which is an album that took me years to finally get around to listen to, but I absolutely love that one. It's probably one of my favorite albums from Against Me. But once I got all my list together and started looking at albums from that year, I think there was one that really kind of stood out, was a clear choice for me. And that was American 4 by Johnny Cash. Unfortunately, it was the last album that Johnny would release in his lifetime. It was released in November 2002. Of course, Johnny would die. I think it was September of 2003 that he would pass. And listening to this album, the brokenness in his vocals, I think it really played into so many great songs on here. Over the course of his incredible career, I would put American 4 up That's probably one of the best albums he ever did. And if I was making a list of the 10 best albums of the 2000s, I'd probably have this one on it. Of course, this album I think is mainly known for the two big singles off it. Both Hurt and Personal Jesus were huge successes, but, so many great covers on this one. You take a track like Bridge Over Troubled Water that he did with Fiona Apple, just an absolute masterpiece. He did such a great job with the songs on this album that, he picked that, you would never thought Johnny Cash would sing. And he took those songs and made them into his own. 2003 was another tough year for me. A lot of really great ones came out. There's some really classic albums that came out in 2003. Some of the ones I did consider Elephant by the White Stripes, which I'm sure is one that a lot of people would have up there for that year. Meteora by Linkin Park. I know I mentioned that earlier, but it is a great album. I don't think it's the best of that year, though. Get Rich or Die Trying, one of the best rap albums of the 2000s, of course, by 50 Cent. The Atari, So Long for Astoria. RPM by Rise Against. The War on Terrorism by NoFX. Before Everything and After by MXPX, which is one of my favorite albums from that band. I don't think it's the best album that year, though. I had to go with the Untitled album from Blink-182. I didn't want to have another Blink album on the list. I really tried to limit it to just one album from a band. And this is an album that I know a lot of people won't agree with this out there, but I would put this album up there as one of the top 20 or 25 albums of all time. It's so very different than what they did earlier, with Enema of the State and Take Off Your Pants and Jacket. And there are some of those elements from those earlier albums on here, but the evolution of the band at this point, they've gone off in such a completely different direction. I mean, even doing songs with Robert Smith on this one. It's one of those albums that, over the last, 22 years, it's probably one of my most played albums. 2004 for me was a year that I think was very clear what my number one was going to be. Yes, there were some other great ones that came out that year. I've got The College Dropout by Kanye West, Three Cheers for Sweet Revenge by My Chemical Romance, Encore by Eminem, How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb by U2, Contraband by Velvet Revolver came out the year, which is just a massive album. Also Siren Song of the Counterculture by Rise Against. But there's one album that I knew I was going to have at number one on this one. And I think a lot of people probably out there will have this one also. It's just a massive album. And that's American Idiot by Green Day. I know at this point people are probably like, hey, you've got a lot of punk music on this list, but trust me, we're going to be soon going away from that. I think this album really kind of ended that whole punk revival of the early part of the decade. Yes, there were some other great ones that came out after this album, but I think as far as like dominating a year, 2004 was the last year that a punk album did that. Even though I really don't consider this album a punk album, I think the last true punk album from Green Day was probably either Insomniac or Nimrod. There's no doubt that American Idiot drew a whole new generation into their music. And it seems like every 10 years or so we have one of those albums, where a whole new generation of music fans discovers punk music. And a lot of people did through this album. So then that takes us to 2005. And 2005, well, it wasn't a great year for music. There were some good albums that came out, but I kind of had a hard time picking what I would say is the best album for that year. Some of the ones I did consider: The Massacre by 50 Cent, From Under the Cork Tree by Fall Out Boy, Out of Exile by Audio Slave, Unplugged by Alicia Keys, which I think is probably one of the most underrated Unplugged albums of all time. But the album I decided to go with was one that I think was one of the more commercially successful albums of that year, and that was Late Registration by Kanye West. This is the album that really got me into Kanye's music. The College Dropout was a big album, had a couple of good tracks off there, but it was this album here that really made me like his music and start going back and checking out The College Dropout. Of course, Gold Digger was a huge track, and probably it's probably one of my least favorite songs on this album. This is definitely one of those albums where the biggest track off of it is nowhere close to being the best. And Late Registration kicked off an incredible string of albums from Kanye. Yeah, a decade or so later, he would go crazy and do all sorts of crazy stuff. But, I've always been somebody that could separate the art from the artist, and I still love this album to this day. If I had to break down the decade by year, 2006 is probably my favorite year of the decade. It was one of those years where it was almost every week another iconic album was coming out. And honestly, of the decade, it was probably the last great year. But some of the great albums I did consider for that year: Back to Black by Amy Winehouse, which is an absolute masterpiece of an album; On an Island by David Gilmour; Never Trust a Hippie and Wolves in Wolves Clothing by NoFX. I think Never Trust a Hippie is probably one of the best 10-inch EPs of the entire decade. Pearl Jam released their self-titled album. Nelly Furtado released Loose. The Sufferer and the Witness by Rise Against. Plus 44, which is the band that Mark Hoppus and Travis Barker put together after the breakup of Blink-182, would release their album When Your Heart Stops Beating that year. But out of all those iconic albums, and all the ones I did mention, I think there is one that was clearly above all the other ones, and that is The Black Parade by My Chemical Romance. So this album came out in late October of 2006, but it was earlier, I think it was the early half or the first half of September, the band would release Welcome to the Black Parade as a single. And I swear, at least here in southeastern Michigan, you couldn't turn the radio on and listen to the radio. It seemed like every hour or every half an hour they were playing that single. So by the time the band released the album, I picked it up. I didn't get it when it was first released. I think it was like a week or two after I grabbed it. It was one of those albums that I don't think it left my CD player in my car for probably the next 4 or 5 months. I remember at the time I was driving a Jeep Grand Cherokee, and that winter we got a bunch of snow here in southeastern Michigan, and it was way too cold. I didn't want to go out there and shovel my long driveway. So I would go out there, put it in four-wheel drive, and just drive up and down the driveway, at least for my wife to be able to get out of the house. But I would listen to this album just nonstop the entire time I was out there. And that's an album that I think would go on to be one of the more iconic albums of the decade. So the album I picked for 2007 is one that might get some head scratches out there. To be honest, is one that I kind of went back and forth between 3 or 4 other albums, and then I decided on this one. This is one of those years where, I could have easily picked a host of other albums, but I decided to go with this one just because I listened to it so much. But, some of the great albums that came out that year that I considered: Graduation by Kanye West, Icky Thump by the White Stripes, probably their best album. I know Elephant is probably picked often as their best album. I think Icky Thump, as a complete album, is maybe a little bit better. Minutes to Midnight by Linkin Park, The Best Damn Thing by Avril Lavigne, Black Rain by Ozzy, which I think is a criminally underrated album from Ozzy. New Wave by Against Me, which is one I long considered probably the best for that year. I just had to go a little bit of a different direction, though. Secret Weapon by MXPX, which I think is probably, out of their entire catalog, maybe their most underrated album. But to be completely honest, the album I picked for 2007 is one that I don't think I ever listened to the entire album until within the last probably 5 or 6 years. But since then, it's become one of my favorites. And that is I Empire by Angels and Airwaves. So I think the reason I never really listened to this album all that much is because I was such a big Blink fan. And when Tom left and started Angels and Airwaves, and they released their first album, We Don't Need to Whisper, I thought it was good, but I think it was just because I was so mad that he left Blink. I never really listened to anything else. And to be honest, their debut album is not great, and maybe that's why it took me so long to check out their other albums. But like I said, over the last 5 or 6 years, this has become a pretty consistent play for me. So 2008, I don't think was a great year for music, but it had a couple of really classic albums that took me a really long time to figure out which one I wanted to pick. I ended up actually having a tie for this year just because I couldn't figure one out. And musically, they're like polar opposites from each other, but some of the other great albums I did consider that year: Adele's debut album 19, which I think is probably her best album; Three Doors Down's self-titled album; Death Magnetic by Metallica, which might be their last great album; Chinese Democracy by Guns N' Roses, which is an album that I didn't really fully appreciate for a few years after it was released. I get it. They're never going to be able to recreate, Appetite for Destruction or Use Your Illusion, but that album has definitely grown on me over the years. I would actually love to see the reformed version of Guns N' Roses go back and re-record Chinese Democracy, because I think a lot of people would look at it a little bit differently than they do now. Go back and listen to the live versions that with Slash and the other guys now. Those versions from those songs off of Chinese Democracy are even better than the recorded versions. But like I said, I got 2 albums from 2008 I just couldn't pick between. The first one is 808s and Heartbreak by Kanye West. This is a very different album, I think, for Kanye, and it was one that I think really kind of helped move rap in a completely new direction in the later part of the decade. So Kanye's mother would die in later part of 2007, and her death would play a big role in the creation of this album. And musically, it was very much a departure from what Kanye did on his first few albums that made him such a huge star. And even though Kanye would go on to do other great albums like My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, I don't think he was ever able to kind of recapture what he did on this album. And I know I said earlier that the Marshall Mathers LP is probably the best rap album of the decade. 808s is probably a close second for me. And then the album that I've got tied with 808s is Appeal to Reason by Rise Against. And this is an album that I probably, up until within the last 2 years, I probably wouldn't have had it in the conversation. But out of any album released in the 2000s, this one's probably grown on me the most. And even as I got into Rise Against over the last several years, I still wouldn't put this up there as one of their best albums. It's probably a tie between this and The Sufferer and the Witness that I put as 1 and 2 now. And if you're looking at punk rock albums of the decade, I think this is probably the last great one that there was. And then rounding out the list with 2009 is another year that I think was a pretty easy one for me to pick, even though there were some other great ones that came out that year. Let the Dominoes Fall by Rancid, The Blueprint 3 by Jay-Z, Green Day would have released 21st Century Breakdown that year. Fame, Fortune, and Fornication by Real Big Fish, which I think is one of the best cover albums of the decade. Eminem would have released Relapse, which I think was a little bit of a down album for him, but still a really good one. Fun would release Aim and Ignite, which I think is probably the best album from Fun. But the album I decided to go with is one that I don't really think there was any really big singles off of this one. Maybe there was one, but I think it's an album that is better than the songs that's really known for. And that's Backspacer by Pearl Jam. Just Breathe, and I think The Fixer were the two kind of big singles off this one, big-ish singles. This is another one of those albums that took me a year or so to finally get around and listen to. When this album came out, I kind of moved away from Pearl Jam at that point. I mean, I would listen to them here or there, but I really didn't dig deep into their catalog. Probably until Lightning Bolt came out. What was that, 2013, I think, when Lightning Bolt came out, is really when I started getting back into their music and rediscovered this album. And, I don't think it's as great as, say, 10 or Vitology or even Yield. But as far as, like, the last half of their catalog goes, I think it's probably one of the best ones they did. I know this album got some pretty mixed reviews when it came out. Maybe that's what kind of played a little bit of a role in taking me a little while to listen to it. I think it's just another one of those examples where an album is so much better than the reviews say they are. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think are the best albums of the 2000s by year. There's so many great ones that I'm sure I left off that, I'll go down through the comments and be reminded of a half a dozen easily I could have put on the list. But let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.